January 17th, 1945. Alsace-Lorraine, France. The morning arrived without mercy. Frost clung to the skeletal branches of birch trees like mourners draped in white, and the earth beneath was iron-hard, unyielding to shovel or boot. Somewhere in the gray distance, artillery rumbled, a sound so constant it had ceased to be alarming, merely the background hum of a world at war. Near the village of Hatten, a handful of American infantrymen crouched in the rubble of what had once been a blacksmith's shop. Their breath came in ragged plumes. Their rifles were frozen. And on the horizon, 5 German Panzer IV tanks ground forward through the snow, their treads chewing the earth into black scars. The men had no anti-tank weapons, no bazookas, no mines. What they carried were Springfield rifles with bolts too cold to chamber rounds, grenades whose pins had rusted in the damp, and something the Wehrmacht had not accounted for: desperation sharpened by months of cold, hunger, and the strange American conviction that surrender was not a vocabulary word they'd been taught. This is the story of how 5 armored machines, each weighing 25 tons, clad in steel plate, and armed with 75mm cannons, were stopped not by superior firepower, but by human hands. It is a story the German High Command would later dismiss as propaganda. It is a story American historians would struggle to categorize. And it is a story that, more than any other, reveals the invisible weapon that won the war. Not democracy, not industry, but the irrational, stubborn refusal of ordinary men to accept the logic of defeat. By January 1945, the war in Europe had become a contest of exhaustion. Nazi Germany, though still capable of ferocious counterattacks, was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The Ardennes offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, had spent its fury in the snows of Belgium, leaving behind burned-out villages and tens of thousands of frozen corpses. Yet Hitler's commanders, true believers in the myth of Teutonic invincibility, still clung to the notion that one more decisive blow might fracture the Allied advance. Alsace-Lorraine had become a killing floor. The region, so long disputed between France and Germany, was now a no-man's land of shattered towns and minefields. American forces, primarily elements of the 14th Armored Division and the 79th Infantry Division, were tasked with holding a thin defensive line stretching from Hatten to Rittershofen. They were understrength, undersupplied, and utterly unprepared for what Hitler's generals were about to unleash. Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive of the war on the Western Front. The men of the 79th had been in combat since the Normandy landings. They had fought through hedgerows, liberated villages, and survived the meat grinder of urban warfare in Cherbourg. They were not green, but they were tired. Their ranks had been thinned by frostbite as much as by enemy fire. They slept in basements and cellars, wrapped in whatever fabric they could scavenge: curtains, tablecloths, enemy overcoats stripped from the dead. And on the morning of January 17th, they awoke to the sound of tank engines. 5 Panzer IVs, supported by a company of Panzer Grenadiers, advanced toward their position with methodical precision. The plan was textbook. Armor would break the line, infantry would exploit the breach, and by nightfall, the Americans would be in full retreat. The Germans had done this 1,000 times before, from Poland to France to the steppes of Russia. There was no reason to believe this morning would be any different, but the Americans did not retreat. The German tank crews, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, had been conditioned to expect certain responses from their enemies. Soviet infantry, they knew, would sometimes charge with suicidal courage, sacrificing entire battalions to slow an advance. British soldiers would dig in and hold, trading ground grudgingly, fighting with cold professionalism. But the Americans, these were the unknown quantity. Reports from other fronts were contradictory. Some German officers spoke of American soldiers as soft, coddled, unwilling to endure hardship. Others, particularly those who had faced the 82nd Airborne or the 1st Infantry Division, spoke with something approaching respect. They fought, these Americans, not with ideology or discipline, but with a kind of improvisational chaos that was difficult to predict. On that frozen morning, the panzer crews expected the Americans to scatter. They expected white flags, perhaps, or at least a hasty withdrawal to secondary positions. What they did not expect was for a sergeant named Harold K. Keller to climb onto the front glacis plate of the lead tank, as it ground past the ruined smithy, pry open the driver's vision port with a trench knife, and drop a thermite grenade inside. The explosion was muffled, internal. The tank continued forward for another 10 meters before lurching to a halt, black smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew did not emerge. What happened next unfolded with a terrible, dreamlike slowness. 3 more American soldiers, Privates Eugene Kowalczyk, James Hendricks, and a man whose name was lost to history, but whose actions were recorded in after-action reports as PFC unknown, rushed the second tank. They had no grenades left. What they had were entrenching tools, iron bars scavenged from the smithy, and their own cold-numbed hands. Kowalczyk wedged a pry bar into the turret ring and levered with all his strength, while Hendricks beat at the periscope housing with a sledgehammer. The tank commander panicked, attempted to traverse the turret to bring the hull machine gun to bear. The mechanism jammed. PFC unknown, acting on some instinct older than training, looped a length of cable, salvaged from a broken winch, around the tank's exhaust pipe and tied the other end to a support beam inside the ruined building. When the tank lurched forward, the cable snapped taut, and the exhaust system tore free in a shriek of metal. Carbon monoxide flooded the crew compartment. Within minutes, the tank was silent. To understand what happened at Hatten, one must understand the Panzer IV. It was not Germany's heaviest tank, nor its most advanced, but it was reliable, mass-produced, and terrifyingly effective when used correctly. Its 75mm gun could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank, save the heaviest British models. Its frontal armor, 80mm thick, could deflect all but the most powerful anti-tank rounds. It was designed to be invulnerable to infantry, but design is not destiny. The Panzer IV, like all tanks, had vulnerabilities. The driver's vision port, though small, was a weak point. The turret ring, the junction where the rotating turret met the hull, could be jammed with foreign objects. The engine, air-cooled and ravenous for oxygen, required functioning exhaust vents. And the crew, sealed inside a steel box with limited visibility, was entirely dependent on their periscopes and vision slits. Blind a tank, and it becomes a coffin. The Americans at Hatten did not know the technical specifications of the Panzer IV. They had not studied its blueprints or attended classes on German armor. What they knew, they had learned through necessity. They knew that tanks were loud, which meant the crew inside could not hear approaching footsteps. They knew that tanks were hot, which meant vision ports were sometimes cracked open for ventilation. They knew that tanks were complex machines, and machines could be broken. Sergeant Keller, in his post-war interview, would describe the moment he climbed onto that first tank as not brave, just too cold to think straight. He had been awake for 36 hours. His hands were so numb he could barely feel the trench knife in his grip. But he remembered something a liaison officer from the French resistance had told him weeks earlier. A tank without eyes is just a steel tomb. So he went for the eyes. The third tank, realizing the danger too late, attempted to reverse. Its driver, blinded by smoke from the burning wreck of the 1st Panzer, backed directly into a crater left by an artillery shell days earlier. The tank's rear slewed downward, its tracks spinning uselessly in the frozen mud. American soldiers swarmed it. They jammed rifles into the treads, bent barrel shrouds, poured gasoline over the engine deck, and lit it with signal flares. The crew, overcome by heat and smoke, abandoned the vehicle and were captured. The 4th tank made it farthest. It broke through the American line and advanced nearly 200 meters before Private Hendricks, bleeding from a shrapnel wound, half deaf from the earlier explosion, ran alongside it, climbed onto the rear deck, and stuffed his overcoat into the air intake grill. The engine, starved of oxygen, coughed, shuddered, and died. The crew, attempting to restart it, were set upon by a squad of engineers who had been repairing a bridge when the attack began. They used wrenches, axes, and a blowtorch. The tank did not burn, but it never moved again. The 5th tank, witnessing the fate of its companions, halted at the edge of effective range. Its commander, a lieutenant named Klaus Biedermann, would later write in his memoirs, published in 1953 under the title Panzer im Schnee, that he could not comprehend what he was seeing. Tanks did not fall to infantry. Not like this. Not without mines or rockets or coordinated ambush. He ordered his driver to withdraw. The Panzer Grenadiers, their morale shattered, followed. By noon, the attack was over. 5 German tanks lay immobilized or destroyed. American casualties, 11 wounded, none killed. German casualties, 19 dead, 34 captured, the rest retreating in disorder. The 79th Infantry Division, battered and exhausted, held the line. In the days that followed, American soldiers searching the wrecked tanks found something unexpected. Ration tins. German rations, stamped with dates from 1943 and 1942, their contents meager. Black bread, ersatz coffee, tinned meat of dubious origin. The Americans, by contrast, carried K rations and C rations, packages so abundant they sometimes discarded half-eaten cans. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, Spam, that much maligned but calorie-dense block of pressed pork. It became a symbol, that Spam. Soldiers would joke about it, complain about it, trade it for French wine or German souvenirs. But to the German prisoners, it was incomprehensible. One captured Panzer Grenadier, interviewed by a military intelligence officer, asked how the Americans could afford to throw away food. The officer, not understanding the question at first, eventually realized the German was not asking about logistics. He was asking about philosophy. How could a nation that wasted food also field an army that fought with such reckless, improvisational fury? The two facts seemed contradictory. Abundance should breed softness. Comfort should erode will. And yet here were men who climbed onto tanks with their bare hands, who jammed overcoats into engine intakes, who refused to retreat even when every rational calculation said they should. The Spam, in its own absurd way, became the answer. It represented not just industrial capacity, but a fundamental difference in worldview. The Wehrmacht fought for Lebensraum, for the survival of the Reich, for abstract notions of blood and soil. The Americans fought because they had been told to, because their friends were beside them, and because, somewhere in the back of their cold, tired minds, they believed that a country which could send them chocolate bars and cigarettes in the middle of a war was a country worth defending. The battle at Hatten did not change the course of the war. Operation Nordwind would continue for another 3 weeks, resulting in thousands of casualties on both sides before finally collapsing under its own unsustainable momentum. The 79th Infantry Division would continue fighting, crossing the Rhine in March, pushing into the heart of Germany in April. Most of the men who fought that day would never speak of it again. Sergeant Keller would return to Iowa, open a hardware store, and die in 1982, without ever telling his grandchildren what he had done on that frozen morning in Alsace. But the story spread. It moved through the ranks like a folk tale, embellished and distorted with each retelling. By the time it reached rear echelon headquarters, it had become a legend. An entire platoon of Americans defeating a German armored column with nothing but bayonets and determination. General George Patton, upon hearing a version of the story, supposedly remarked, "That's the damnedest thing I've ever heard. Give those boys a medal." Whether he actually said this is uncertain. What is certain is that the 79th Infantry Division was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions during Operation Nordwind. For the Germans, the battle became a wound that would not close. Biedermann's memoir, though published years after the war, captures the psychological rupture. "We had been taught that armor was invincible," he wrote, "that men on foot were as helpless before a panzer as peasants before a dragon. But in Hatten we learned that myths can die as easily as men. And when a myth dies, what is left? What was left was the slow, grinding realization that the war was lost. Not because of any single battle, but because the enemy they faced was fundamentally different from what their ideology had prepared them for. The Americans did not fight with discipline or fanaticism. They fought with improvisation, with pragmatism, with a kind of cheerful irreverence toward the rules of warfare. They climbed onto tanks because no one had told them it was impossible. They jammed overcoats into engines because they had overcoats and the tanks had engines. They won not because they were better soldiers, but because they refused to accept the premise that they could not win. There is a photograph, grainy and faded, taken by a Signal Corps cameraman 3 days after the battle. It shows Sergeant Keller standing beside one of the wrecked panzers, his hand resting on the turret. He is not smiling. His face is gaunt, shadowed by exhaustion and something deeper. Perhaps the knowledge that he has done something impossible, and that impossibility is a burden as much as a triumph. The photograph was never published in wartime. It sat in an archive for decades, labeled only with a date and a location. No names, no context, just a man and a machine, and the silent testimony of what human will can accomplish when it refuses to be logical. In the end, the battle at Hatten was not about tanks or tactics. It was about the collision of two world views. On one side, a military machine that believed in the supremacy of technology, in the inevitability of its own victory, in the idea that steel and discipline could overcome any obstacle. On the other side, a collection of tired, cold, hungry men who believed in nothing so grand, only that they had a job to do, and that the job was not finished. The German tanks were defeated not by superior engineering, but by the simple, stubborn insistence that they could be defeated. And in that insistence lay the seed of everything that would follow: the crossing of the Rhine, the fall of Berlin, the end of the 1,000-year Reich. Wars are not won by tanks or planes or bombs. They are won by the hands that refuse to let go, the feet that refuse to retreat, the hearts that refuse to accept the verdict of steel. On a frozen morning in Alsace, 5 tanks learned this truth, and the men who taught them, armed with nothing but cold hands and improvised fury, wrote a chapter in history that no one had thought to plan. They did not defeat armor with armor. They defeated it with something older, something that no amount of Krupp steel could contain: the human refusal to be conquered. And in the wreckage of those panzers, Buried beneath snow and silence, that refusal still echoes, a whisper of iron bent by flesh, of logic shattered by will, of the moment when 5 machines met their match in the calloused, frost-bitten hands of men who had forgotten how to surrender.